You know how some people have a gift for making a room warmer just by walking into it? Well, my father-in-law, Frank Mallory, has the opposite gift. He can suck the air out of a room before he even sits down. My name is Daniel Carter. I am 42 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, and I now live in Philadelphia. I run my own private equity firm called Red Haven Capital, and I have spent the last 15 years building it from the ground up. We manage more than $180 million in assets, specializing in early-stage investments that most people overlook. I have worked with some of the sharpest minds in medicine, technology, and manufacturing, but for the last 4 years, I have been married to Claire, and her father is the one man who treats me like I am nothing more than a placeholder in life. Frank is 68, a once respected name in the pharmaceutical manufacturing industry here in Philadelphia. He inherited the company from his own father and rode its success like a wave, but the wave has been breaking for years now. His company is bleeding money, losing contracts, and falling behind on innovation. Not that he would ever admit it. At every family gathering, from Thanksgiving dinners to Sunday barbecues, Frank makes it his personal mission to let me know exactly what he thinks of me. "You are just a paper pusher," he will sneer across the table, his voice dripping with disdain, as if my work in finance could never measure up to his so-called hands-on manufacturing empire. The first few times, I laughed it off. I told myself it was just generational differences, maybe some light teasing, but it never stopped. Frank had a way of leaning back in his chair, swirling his drink, and launching into a monologue about real men who build things with their hands and take risks instead of hiding behind contracts and spreadsheets. He would glance at me like I was a child who had wandered into the adults' conversation, and I could feel the unspoken challenge in his eyes. I knew his type. Men who measure their worth not by what they have achieved, but by how loudly they can diminish someone else. What made it worse was Claire's silence. She would sit there, her eyes darting between me and her father, sometimes forcing an awkward smile or changing the subject, but never telling him to stop. It was as if she had built this quiet wall between us, where his behavior was something I was expected to accept, like bad weather or traffic. At first, I told myself she was just keeping the peace. Over time, I started wondering if her silence was really agreement. And that thought, that maybe my own wife saw me through his eyes, was like a splinter I could not pull out. Frank did not insult everyone. That was the part that made it sting more. To other guests, he was charming, almost magnetic. He would pour them a drink, ask about their kids, even brag about their accomplishments. But with me, it was open season. He would bring up my work in the middle of a toast, making jokes about how I probably needed a calculator to figure out the tip at a restaurant. He would ask if I had ever been inside a factory, like I was some pampered rich kid who had never lifted a finger. And every time, the room would give this polite, uncomfortable laugh, the kind that says, "We know this is wrong, but we are not going to step in." I am not a man who enjoys confrontation, but I am also not a man who forgets. I have built my career on seeing opportunities where others do not, and I have learned that sometimes the best revenge is not loud. It is patient. I never challenged Frank at the table. I never raised my voice or told him what I really thought of him. But each insult, each smirk, each sideways glance was quietly filed away, like numbers in a ledger that one day would be balanced. And in the back of my mind, I knew that the day would come when Frank Mallory would find out exactly who he had been talking to all these years. In the early days of our marriage, I told myself Claire's quiet during her father's jabs was just diplomacy. She grew up in a house where Frank's word was law, and I figured she had learned early that challenging him was like trying to stop the tide. You might win for a moment, but the water always comes back stronger. I thought maybe she was protecting me in her own way by refusing to fuel the fire. But over time, That explanation stopped feeling like comfort and started sounding like an excuse. The thing about silence is that it speaks, and Claire's silence at those dinners told me more than any argument could. She would sit there with her wine glass, eyes lowered, letting his words hang in the air. Sometimes she would force a smile, that polite, practiced one that looked like it had been rehearsed in front of a mirror for years. Other times she would simply change the subject, sliding away from the confrontation like it was a spill on the floor no one wanted to mop up. But not once did she turn to her father and say, "That's enough." Not once did she tell him he was wrong. I started noticing that after those dinners, Claire would talk about how exhausting they were. But she never mentioned what had been said to me. She would complain about her mother's gossip, about her brother's terrible taste in wine, about the overcooked roast beef, but never about the fact that her husband had been publicly humiliated by her father for sport. It was like those moments just vanished for her, while for me, they sat like a stone in my stomach. One night, after another round of Frank's Real Men speech, I asked her in the car, "Does it bother you when he talks to me like that?" She hesitated, staring out the passenger window, and finally said, "He does not mean anything by it. That is just how he is." That answer told me everything I needed to know. She was not just tolerating it. On some level, she was accepting it. And if you accept something long enough, it starts to look like agreement. What made it worse was knowing she had defended others in the past. I had seen her call out her boss for taking credit for her coworker's project. I had seen her tell off a stranger for cutting in line at the grocery store. She had backbone when she wanted to. But when it came to me versus her father, I was always the one expected to absorb the blow and smile through it. That was when something inside me shifted. I stopped looking at Frank's behavior as the main problem and started looking at Claire's silence as the bigger betrayal. Frank was who he was, loud, arrogant, and incapable of respect. But Claire was supposed to be on my side. And the more I realized she was not, the more I started thinking about how one day both of them might regret underestimating me. Frank liked to imagine me as some mid-level pencil pusher, shuffling papers in a cubicle under fluorescent lights. I never corrected him. Let him think that if it made him feel taller. The truth was far different. I am the founder and managing partner of Red Haven Capital, a private equity firm I started 12 years ago with nothing more than a small inheritance, a good reputation from my early banking years, and a willingness to bet on companies no one else believed in. Today, we manage over $180 million in assets, spread across industries from clean energy to medical technology. My job is not just about money. It is about vision, spotting the seed of something great before the world sees it bloom. I kept that side of my life deliberately quiet around Claire's family, not because I was hiding it, but because I knew the value of being underestimated. When people think you are small, they tell you more than they should. They make mistakes around you because they do not see you as a threat. Frank's ego was so inflated that he never once thought to ask what I actually did, and I saw no reason to volunteer the truth. It was like watching someone sit down at a poker table without realizing you had been holding all the winning cards from the start. My work has always been about timing, knowing when to step in, when to wait, and when to walk away. Over the years, I have learned that some of the most profitable moves come from doing nothing at all, letting events unfold until the opportunity is perfect. I have seen CEOs who thought they were untouchable lose their companies because they underestimated the wrong person. That knowledge sat in my back pocket every time Frank opened his mouth to mock me. What Frank did not know was that I had a quiet eye on his own company, Mallory Pharma, for months. It started out as curiosity. I keep tabs on regional businesses, especially in industries tied to healthcare, and I knew Mallory Pharma was not the empire it used to be. Its patents were aging, its client list shrinking, and its cash flow tightening like a noose. But they still had potential, if the right investor stepped in. I had been in early anonymous talks through my firm about a possible buy-in, the kind that could keep them alive and even make them competitive again. Sitting at those family dinners, listening to Frank talk about how I could not survive in the real world, I would sometimes think about the irony. He had no idea that the so-called paper pusher across the table was one signature away from being the only reason his company would keep its doors open. I did not say a word. Patience is a skill I have mastered, and Frank Mallory was about to give me the perfect reason to use it. From the outside, Mallory Pharma still carried the shadow of its old prestige. The building was big and impressive. The logo still shone from the front facade, and Frank still wore the title of CEO like a crown. But once you looked past the surface, the cracks were obvious. My research team had pulled the numbers: slipping revenue, declining product lines, patents nearing expiration, and a few quiet layoffs buried in the back pages of the local business journal. They were losing ground in an industry that punishes anyone who slows down. I had been tracking them quietly for over half a year, never letting my name touch the paperwork. Through Red Haven Capital, I had a shell of a presence in the conversation, enough to monitor their moves without raising suspicion. I saw the desperation setting in. They were late on key supply chain payments, negotiating with new distributors that were far smaller and less reliable, and hinting, without ever saying it directly, that they needed a major cash injection to keep going. It was not a question of if they needed an investor, but when they would be forced to take one. And that was the part that fascinated me. Frank strutted around family dinners like a man in complete control of his empire. But the truth was, he was standing on a cliff edge, blindfolded. He had no idea that the market saw him as a liability. He had no idea that every month he delayed a serious deal, the ground beneath him eroded just a little more. I was positioned to be his lifeline. A $12 million buy-in from Red Haven would have stabilized their books, funded new R&D, and bought them time to get competitive again. In the right hands, it could have been a profitable venture for me and a public save for him. Every time Frank looked across the table and made some cutting remark about men who do not know what hard work looks like, I would picture the confidential reports in my office, the ones detailing just how badly he needed someone like me. I never showed my cards. I wanted him to keep talking, keep believing that his kingdom was untouchable. There is a strange satisfaction in watching someone dig their own hole, especially when you know they will eventually turn and look up at you from the bottom. The truth was, I was not even sure yet if I wanted to make the deal. On paper, Mallory Pharma was a salvageable investment, but in my gut, I knew working with Frank could turn any business arrangement toxic. Still, I kept my position open. If the timing was right and the terms were good, I could make the move. What I did not know then was that Frank himself was going to make that decision for me, and he would not like the answer. Claire's 40th birthday was supposed to be a celebration. She had booked a private dining room at a downtown steakhouse, invited her closest friends, her family, and a few of my colleagues. The place had this warm, amber glow, the kind of atmosphere that makes you think for a moment that nothing bad could possibly happen. I had bought her a sapphire necklace she had once admired in a shop window, and for the first time in months, I thought maybe this night would be different. Maybe Frank would find it in himself to just behave. Of course I was wrong. He walked in late smelling faintly of whiskey, already smiling that tight, smug smile that meant he was ready to perform. The first half hour was fine. He chatted with the guests, shook hands with my colleagues, even complimented the wine. I almost let my guard down. But then the main course arrived, and like clockwork, he shifted the spotlight to me. "You know, Daniel," he said loud enough for the whole table to hear, "I sometimes wonder how a guy like you makes it in the real world. All those numbers and no real work. I guess some people just get lucky." The room went quiet for a second, that awkward kind of silence where everyone pretends to focus on their food. I glanced at Claire. She was smiling stiffly, eyes fixed on her plate, like maybe if she ignored it hard enough, it would not exist. That was the moment something inside me snapped, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quiet, final way. A door clicks shut. I realized she was not embarrassed for me. She was embarrassed by me. She was embarrassed that her father was saying out loud the thing she maybe thought herself. I excused myself mid-meal, setting down my fork like I was just stepping away for a moment. I walked out past the gold-trimmed doors of that steakhouse and into the crisp night air, the noise of the party fading behind me. I did not feel angry. I felt free. I had been carrying the weight of their opinions for years, waiting for a sign that Claire would choose my side, and now I had it. She already had. It just was not my side she had chosen. In the back of my mind, I thought of the deal I had been preparing, the $12 million that could have saved Mallory Pharma from collapse. That night, the decision was made for me. As I walked to my car, I pulled out my phone and called my attorney. "Cancel the Mallory deal," I said, my voice steady. "Completely. I do not want my name anywhere near it." He started to ask why, but I ended the call. Frank Mallory had spent years making sure I knew exactly what I was worth to him. Now I was about to show him what he was worth to me. The drive home from the steakhouse was quiet. Just the hum of the tires on the pavement and the low rhythm of my thoughts. I was not replaying Frank's words in my head. I had heard them enough times to have them memorized. What I kept seeing was Claire's face, that fixed, polite expression, as if my humiliation was just background noise she had learned to live with. It was the final confirmation I needed. Any illusions I had about her standing up for me, about her drawing a line with her father, had just dissolved into the cold air outside that restaurant. By the time I reached my driveway, the decision was more than made. It was set in stone. I poured myself a drink, sat in my office, and opened the file on my desk marked Mallory Pharma, investment terms. $12 million. That was the figure I had been prepared to commit. The contracts were drafted, the lawyers were ready, and all it needed was my signature. Instead, I sent one short email to my attorney. "Withdraw immediately. Notify all parties. Terminate discussions without exception." No explanations, no apologies. I wanted it done before I had a chance to second-guess myself, before any shred of sentiment could sneak in and convince me to save the man who had spent years telling me I was nothing. Within an hour, my phone buzzed. My attorney had already sent the termination notice to the intermediaries handling the deal. I knew it would land on Frank's desk by morning. I could almost picture him reading it, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening, while he scrambled to figure out why his anonymous lifeline had suddenly cut the rope. What he could never guess was that the rope had been in my hands the entire time. There was a strange peace in it. For months, I had been weighing the business upside against the personal cost. Now there was no balance to strike. I had chosen, and I had chosen myself. It was not revenge in the shouting, chest-thumping sense. It was quieter than that, more deliberate. The kind of revenge that comes with the calm certainty that you have nothing to prove anymore. Before I shut down my computer for the night, I leaned back in my chair and thought about Frank's favorite phrase, how I wouldn't last a week in the real world. The real world, as far as I could see, was about knowing when to walk away from a bad deal, no matter how profitable it might be on paper. And in that moment, pulling the plug on Mallory Pharma was not just good business. It was the cleanest, sharpest statement I could ever make. By 8 the next morning, the withdrawal notice was in Frank's hands. I did not have to be there to imagine the scene. Him sitting behind that oversized mahogany desk, flipping through the crisp letterhead. his brow furrowing as the reality sank in. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he would be calculating what this meant, who he could call, how much time he had left. But one thing I knew for certain, he would have no idea that the investor who had just cut him off had been sitting at his dinner table for years. I was halfway through my first coffee when my phone rang. It was Claire. Her voice was tight, clipped, the way it gets when she is trying not to lose her temper. "Daniel, something happened with Dad's company," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "The investor they've been negotiating with just pulled out, completely. No explanation. He's in a panic. Can you help him find someone else?" I let the question hang in the air for a beat before answering. "You are talking to him," I said. Silence. The kind that is heavy enough to feel. "What are you talking about?" she finally asked. "I was the investor, Claire. Red Haven Capital is mine. The $12 million your father was counting on. It was my deal. And after last night, I decided I have better places to put my money." Her breath caught, like she was about to say something. But she did not. "You are willing to let his company fail just because of a dinner argument?" she demanded, her voice rising. "No," I said evenly. "I am letting it fail because for years he's made it clear exactly what I'm worth to him. Now I'm showing him what he's worth to me." Later that afternoon, I sent 2 text messages. The first went to Claire. "If you ever wonder why I made that call, replay every dinner where you let him tear me down without a word." The second went to Frank. "Consider this a lesson in treating people like they matter. It might have been the difference between survival and collapse. I did not send either to start a fight. I sent them because they were the truth, and I wanted that truth written down in black and white, something they could not twist or forget. Frank would see it as arrogance. Claire would see it as coldness. But for me, it was simply closing a chapter I should have ended a long time ago." Claire did not call me back that night. Instead, she sent a short text, 5 words that told me everything. "We need to talk. Tomorrow." When she showed up at my apartment the next morning, she was wearing that same tight expression she'd worn at the steakhouse, like she was holding her breath to keep from exploding. She went straight to the point. "You didn't just embarrass him, Daniel. You humiliated our whole family. People will hear about this." I leaned against the kitchen counter, letting her words hang in the air. "Claire, I didn't destroy your father's company. I just stopped saving it. There's a difference." She crossed her arms, eyes sharp. "You could have kept business and family separate. I almost laughed at that. Your father made sure that was never an option. Every dinner, every holiday, every time he decided I was his personal punching bag, he made it personal. I just finally responded in kind." Her face tightened, and I could see the wall between us solidifying. A week later, the divorce papers arrived. I was not shocked. By then, we were 2 people living on opposite sides of an unspoken war. But what I did not expect came a month after that. Claire called me, calm, almost flat, and told me she had cut ties with her father. Apparently, she had confronted him about the years of public humiliation, and he had laughed. Laughed, as if the pain he caused was some harmless joke everyone else should have been in on. She said it was the last conversation they would ever have. It was strange hearing that. I felt no victory in it. This was not the kind of revenge where you pop champagne. It was more like watching a building collapse in slow motion, silent, inevitable, and irreversible. Claire had chosen to walk away from both of us, and in her own way, she had finally experienced what I had felt for years. That moment when you realize someone will never respect you, no matter what you do. Frank, of course, saw it differently. In his mind, I was the villain, the man who had sabotaged his career out of spite. I could live with that. People like Frank never look in the mirror long enough to see the truth. And as far as I was concerned, The cracks in their family had been there long before I came along. I just stopped pretending not to see them. Once the deal was gone, Mallory Pharma's unraveling was almost immediate. It started quietly. Suppliers tightening credit terms. A key distributor hesitating to renew their contract. Then it spread like a crack through glass. Investors who had been hanging on for the big turnaround began pulling their funds, sensing the tide had turned against Frank. Within a month, whispers in the industry made it clear. Mallory Pharma was no longer a safe bet. By the end of the quarter, those whispers had turned into a loud, collective retreat. Frank tried to patch the holes. He scrambled for smaller investors, the kind who were more desperate than discerning, but they were not enough to fill a $12 million gap. Layoffs began. First a handful of administrative staff, then half the R&D team. Every move he made to save money only made the company less competitive. Former clients took their contracts elsewhere, chasing stability Mallory Pharma could no longer provide. And in the pharmaceutical world, once your reputation slips, it is nearly impossible to pull it back. I would hear updates without even looking for them. Colleagues would mention the collapse in passing. Industry newsletters would feature another grim headline, and more than once, someone would ask me offhand if I had ever considered acquiring them back when they were still viable. I always gave the same answer. I considered it, but the timing wasn't right. I never elaborated. Those who understood business understood enough. By the 5th month, Mallory Pharma filed for bankruptcy. The factory floor went dark, the logo came down from the building, and the Mallory name, once a staple in Philadelphia's business community, was reduced to a cautionary tale. Frank lost the family estate, sold off his luxury cars, and quietly moved into a modest condo on the outskirts of town. The man who used to toast his own brilliance at every dinner table was now working as a contract consultant for one of his former competitors, a position that paid well enough to live, but not to rebuild an empire. I did not take pleasure in seeing him brought low. It was not about gloating or victory laps. For me, it was simply watching the final act of a story he had been writing for years. He had stood on that cliff edge for too long, ignoring the warning signs, mocking the one person who could have pulled him back. All I did was step away and let gravity do the rest. After Mallory Pharma collapsed, the story moved on without me. Frank became a name people mentioned in passing, usually followed by a slow shake of the head or a comment about how quickly things can change. Claire built a new life in another city, working at a nonprofit research institute. We have not spoken in over a year. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if she ever replayed those dinners in her mind, if she ever realized how much her silence cost us both. But then I remind myself, it is not my question to answer anymore. I moved to Seattle, expanding Red Haven Capital into new markets, taking on deals that excite me instead of just pad the bottom line. My days are full, my work is thriving, and I choose the people I keep in my life with care. There is a freedom in that, a quiet, steady kind of peace that comes from knowing you have no one left to prove yourself to. Every so often I hear about Frank's consulting work. He is competent enough to get hired, but no one treats him like the king he once fancied himself to be. The irony is not lost on me. For years, he loved to tell me I would not last in the real world. Now he is living in it, stripped of the safety nets and the applause, earning his keep like the rest of us. I do not gloat. I simply note the symmetry. People sometimes ask me if I regret pulling the plug. The answer is no. Because here is what I have learned. Respect is not something you can demand at the dinner table. It is not something you inherit or bully into existence. It is earned, moment by moment, through the way you treat people when no one else is watching. Frank never learned that. And Claire? Maybe she never wanted to, but I have, and it has shaped every decision I make now. Revenge, in my case, was never about destroying someone. It was about refusing to be part of their survival when they had made it clear I was worthless in their eyes. I did not push Frank off a cliff. I just stopped holding the rope. And as I look around at the life I have built, on my own terms, with my own choices, I realize that walking away was not just the smartest thing I ever did. It was the moment I stopped letting anyone else define my worth.